The county surveyor's chain lay coiled in the tall grass like a snake that had given up, and Delia Marsh stood over the buried thing her pigs had rooted from the earth, her hands black to the wrist, her breath loud in the empty morning. It was a millstone, a great disk of dressed granite, wider than a wagon wheel, its edge worn smooth by hands and years long gone to dust, and around it lay the broken timbers of a foundation nobody in Callow County had known was there. Behind her, the whole town's laughter still hung in her ears. 3 years of it, but the laughter had gone quiet now. She knelt in the mud with her hands buried in the ruin of an old cider mill, and the men who had come to gawk stood at the fence rail saying nothing at all. There is a particular silence that falls over people who have been proven wrong and have not yet decided how they will bear it, and that silence lay heavy over the fence rail that morning. 2 springs earlier, they had agreed to a man that she had thrown her money into a briar patch and would come crawling back before winter. She had not come crawling back. She had not come to them at all. She had come here instead, to this stone, and to what it would mean for every hungry family in the valley before the year was out. She wiped a smear of black earth from the granite with her palm, and read the faint chisel marks a stranger had cut into it a lifetime ago, and she understood that the ground beneath her feet had been keeping a secret longer than she had been alive, and that it had chosen at last to give that secret to the one person patient enough to dig for it. 2 springs earlier, on a raw March morning in the year of our Lord 1887, Delia Marsh raised her hand at the courthouse auction and bought 30 acres that no sane person in Callow County wanted. She was 26 years old, with no husband and no father living and no brother to sign for her, and the auctioneer had looked twice before he took her bid, as if a young woman alone must have wandered in by mistake and would presently apologize and sit back down. The parcel was the old herd place, and everyone knew what had become of it. Greenbrier had taken it. Not a stray patch of thorn along a fence line, but a whole sea of it, acre upon acre of green cable strung with barbs, grown so thick over 20 fallow years that a grown man could not push 10 feet into it without leaving skin on the vine and blood on the ground. The herds had let it go and gone west and died out there of the cholera or the loneliness, nobody rightly knew which, and the land had passed to the county for unpaid taxes, and now it sat on the block at 90 cents an acre because no one would give $1. Delia gave $27 for the whole of it, counted out in coins and worn paper on the clerk's high desk, nearly the last of what her mother had left her in a tin box under the floorboards. When she signed the deed, the clerk asked her, kindly enough, whether she understood that a person could not farm a thing that could not be plowed, and that no plow blade forged in that state would cut a Greenbrier root without snapping. She said she understood it. Fine. She said it plainly, and she did not smile, and she did not tell him what she meant to do, because she had learned young that a plan spoken aloud is a plan handed to men who will find 50 reasons it cannot work, and who will remember, if you fail, every word of it. The reasons came anyway, unasked for and unpaid. She had rented a bare room over the feed store while she worked, a narrow room that smelled of grain dust and mice, and she could not walk to the well of a morning without hearing what the valley thought of her. Old Wren Tucker, who owned 400 acres of Good Creek bottomland, and had wanted the herd place for nothing, so he could run cattle down to the water that crossed its far corner, told anyone who would stand still long enough that the Marsh girl had bought herself a headache and a thorn thicket and would be selling it back to him by August for half of what she paid. You'd have done better to sleep in the street, he said to her once, right there on the boardwalk in front of the mercantile, with a broad smile that meant to be taken as neighborly concern. It'd have cost you less and you'd have kept your hands. She looked at him a long moment and said nothing at all, which annoyed him more than any answer could have, and she went on to the well with her bucket. There is a certain kind of man who cannot bear a silence he did not cause, who reads it as insolence or as stupidity, but never as strength, and Wren Tucker was that kind of man to the marrow. Behind her back they already had a name for the place. Marsh's Misery, they called it. And they laughed the easy laugh of people spending another's misfortune, and they went home to their suppers certain of exactly how the story would end, and pleased to have it settled. What Delia had that they did not have was a memory and a pair of eyes that had taught themselves to work. She had grown up poor on a hardscrabble hill farm 2 counties over, the kind of place where a wet spring or a dry one was the difference between eating and not, and she had watched her grandmother keep the whole family alive one killing winter on nothing but what the hogs turned up in the frozen woods. Hogs, her grandmother used to say in the slow way of the old country, God gave the hog a nose, so that a poor woman would never starve. A pig turned loose in a thing. Men cannot enter, will go where a man cannot go, and eat what a man cannot cut, and leave the ground behind it broken open and clean, as if an army of small plows had passed. Greenbrier, Delia knew, grows from a great swollen root the size of a man's fist, a hard-knotted tuber buried deep in the dirt, and this was the thing few in that valley had ever troubled to learn, that a hog will hunt that root as though it were the sweetest acorn in the world, will dig for it and crunch it between its jaws, and grow fat and glad on the doing, where a scythe cuts the vine and leaves the root to send up 10 green shoots in place of the one. A hog eats the root entire, and there is nothing left in the ground to send up anything at all. She had not bought a briar patch. She had bought 2 years of free feed for her animals and 30 acres that would be tilled without a plow, if only she could be patient enough and stubborn enough to let the beasts do the work that men swore could not be done. She spent nearly the last of her money on pigs. 11 of them, bought lean and cheap from farms glad to be rid of the extra mouths that early in a lean spring, and a great boar that a man let go for almost nothing because it had a temper and had put a scar on his son's leg. She drove them out to the misery, on foot along the rutted county road, a strange, slow procession, that half the town came out onto their porches to watch and comment upon, and she built a rough pen of split rails against the one clear corner where the creek came in cold off the ridge. And then she did the thing that made them certain she had gone soft in the head. She opened the pen at the very edge of the Greenbrier, and she let the hogs walk into it. They vanished into the green, like stones, dropped into a still pond, one after another, the boar last of all, and the thorn closed over them, and there was nothing to see but a wall of leaves. For one long moment, even Delia's own heart failed her, watching the whole of her fortune, every coin she had left in the world, walk on 4 legs into a thicket she might never get it out of again. Then she heard it, low and steady from deep inside the green. The tearing of vine, the wet grunting, the deep contented rooting sound of animals that had found precisely the thing they were made in this world to find. She stood at the rail until full dark came down, listening to her pigs eat her problem, and she did not go back to her cold room until she could no longer see her own hand in front of her face. An old man watched her from the road that first evening, and he was still there the second, leaning on the fence, with the bottomless patience of someone who has already been given all the time the world means to give him. His name was Ansel Vogt, though everyone in the valley said it Vogt, and had for 40 years, and he had come from the old country as a young man with nothing but the clothes on his back, and had made a small, tidy, prosperous farm out of a stony north slope that every neighbor of his day had sworn was fit only for goats and regret. He was near 80 now, and had outlived his wife and both his grown sons, and he watched Delia's pigs work the briar with a light in his pale eyes that she did not understand until he finally spoke. "You know the root," he said, not as a question. "Most don't." She told him she knew it. He nodded slowly and looked out over the green sea of thorn as though he could see clean through it to the black dirt waiting underneath. "My mother did this," he said, "not the briar. A different weed, another country, but the same idea exactly. You let the beast do the thing the beast was made for, and you do not argue with it, and you do not hurry it." He tapped the top rail of the fence with one crooked finger. "Land," he told her, "is not good or bad, the way people are always saying. Land is only asleep, or land is awake, and the whole of the difference between the two is one person willing to wait. She would remember that as long as she lived, she would come to lean her whole weight against it, like a wall in a wind." Ansel came near every day after that, walking down slow, from his own place with a stick, and he taught her things her grandmother had never had cause to know. He showed her how to move the rail pen a little at a time, a few feet each week, so that the pigs worked the acres in orderly strips and did not churn any one patch into a useless wallow of mud and ruin. He showed her how to tell which stands of Greenbrier were oldest by the thickness of the cane and the darkness of the wood, and he told her the thing that mattered most of all, that the oldest and worst-looking stands grow over the very richest ground, because briar is a greedy plant and always sends its roots to where the eating is best, so that the ugliest thicket in a field will more often than not be crouched upon the finest black soil a farmer could pray for. He taught her to read the pigs themselves, to know by the pitch and rhythm of their grunting whether they had struck a good deep vein of root or were only idly nosing about in clear dirt, and to move them along the moment a strip went quiet. And through that first long spring and into the summer, the impossible thing began to happen, slow as any season must be, but real and undeniable. Where the pigs had passed, the wall of thorn was simply gone, not cut back to sprout again twice as thick, but eaten out entire, roots and all, leaving behind torn black earth studded with the pale broken ends of tubers the hogs had missed, which Delia walked behind and grubbed out by hand with a mattock until her palms cracked and healed and went hard as bark. By June, she had cleared better than 3 acres. By the dead white heat of August, she had cleared 8, and the pigs that had gone into the green, lean and ribby, came out of it fat and gleaming, fat enough to make Wren Tucker's mouth go tight as a purse string when he rode his good horse past her fence. She told no one how well it was going. She kept it banked low, like a coal under ash, glowing but unseen. When the feed store men asked her, half laughing, how the misery was treating her, she would say only tolerable, and shrug, and let them laugh their fill, because she had learned that a person who announces good fortune only invites others to come and take a share of it, or worse, to find some way to spoil it out of pure envy. She sold 4 of the fattened hogs at the fall market, for more than she had paid for all 11 together, and with that money she did not buy herself a warm coat or a better roux. She bought more pigs, and she bought seed, and she bought a second-hand plow that a widow, 2 farms over, let go cheap because she was giving up and going to her daughter in the city. That autumn, Delia plowed her first acre of the misery, ground that had not felt the touch of a blade in 20 long years, and the furrow curled up behind the share black, and moist and sweet-smelling, so rich and dark it looked as though it had been lying there all that time simply waiting to be asked. She stood in that first straight furrow, with the plow lines over her shoulder and the smell of the earth rising around her, and she did not weep, because she was not a woman much given to weeping, but something in her chest that had been clenched hard as a fist since the courthouse steps let go a little and breathed. It had worked. The thing they had all sworn could not be done, the arithmetic they were certain would never close, had begun to close. She counted it that night by the lamp the way she counted everything, what the pigs had earned, what the coming litters would bring, what a single acre of good ground might grow and fetch, and for the first time since her mother died, the numbers ran the right direction down the page. Winter came hard that year, with snow to the fence tops and a wind that hunted through every crack, and she wintered the hogs in the sheltered corner and lived close and careful herself. And in the spring, she farrowed her first big litters, and the herd doubled, and by the litters after that it doubled again. She turned the new young pigs into the standing briar, and the green wall fell back another whole season's worth, and behind the retreating line of it she planted corn and turnips and a broad low field of pumpkins and winter squash, because those were the crops that would grow on rough new broken ground before it had been gentled by years of tending, and because a hog that has eaten out your briar through the summer will happily eat your cull pumpkins all through the winter, so that the land fed the pigs, that cleared the land that fed the pigs, around and around. Ansel came and looked at the whole of it laid out in the sun, and nodded his slow nod, and said, "Now you see it. It goes in a circle, you understand. A farm is a circle, or it is nothing at all, only a man fighting the dirt until the dirt wins." By the end of that second summer, more than half the misery lay open to the wide sky, in tilled fields and rooted ground and orderly pig lots, and only the far third of it, the oldest and thickest and darkest stand of all, still stood as a wall of green thorn against the tree line at the property's edge. And it was into that oldest stand, on a bright cool morning at the very start of her third spring on the place, that Delia moved the biggest of her boars and a dozen good sows to break the last of it. The stand that grew, as the old man had taught her, over the richest ground of all the 30 acres. They struck the stone in the third week of that work. She heard it before ever she saw it, a sudden change in the sound of the rooting, a scraping and a squealing of animal frustration, where before there had been only the steady, contented grunt. And she went in along the muddy pig trails they had opened through the thinning briar, and found the sows crowded and shouldering around a place where they had dug down near 2 feet and could dig no further for the thing beneath them. She knelt and cleared the wet mud away with her bare hands, and there it was, dressed granite, flat and true, and cut by human tools, the great round millstone that would, before that week was out, bring the whole of the county to her fence rail. And around it, as she dug and pried and traced the shapes hidden in the dirt, she found the rest of it, sills of oak, gone black and soft as cheese, an iron gudgeon rusted down to a brown wafer, a tail race choked solid with the silt of decades, and the low tumbled stone walls of a building that the Greenbrier had swallowed so completely and so long ago that no living soul in Callow County remembered it had ever stood at all. It was a cider mill, an old one, older than the herds, older than the town, from the earliest days of the valley when the first hopeful orchards were planted and then forgotten. And a mill, Delia knew at once, means falling water, and water in that dry, high country meant everything a body could name. She went to Ansel with the news of it, and the old man came down and walked the ground slowly, prodding here and there with his stick, reading the fall and lie of the land the way she had learned to read the pitch of her pigs. "Here," he said at last, tapping the silted trough with his stick, and here, water came to this place once, and a great deal of it, more than a trickle, or no man would ever have troubled to build a stone to grind. He straightened his old back with an effort and looked at her with those pale, patient, knowing eyes. "There is a spring," he said simply, "buried, choked, sleeping under the leaf rot, like all the rest of your land was sleeping when you came. Find it and clean it out, and you will have water in your hand when every neighbor you have goes dry." And then he said a thing whose full weight she did not understand. Not then, not yet. "This valley," he said, looking up at the fine blue sky, "is going to be very thirsty soon. I have seen a sky do this before. Back in the old country when I was a boy, the spring that comes on too clear and too early and too kind. Mark it well." She looked up and marked the sky, and saw nothing there but a fine soft blue morning without a threat in it anywhere. But she had come to trust the old man's eyes further than she trusted her own, and she set the pigs and herself to the finding of the spring that very afternoon. It took 11 days of hard digging, following the old stone-lined channel back up the slope from the mill foot by foot, until they broke at last into a collapsed stone cistern, half filled with black rotted leaves, and beneath the rot, cold and clear and quietly rising, the spring itself. It had never once stopped flowing. All those 20 and 30 and 50 long years it had gone on patiently filling its buried chamber and seeping away underground, feeding the very Greenbrier that hid it from the world, waiting for someone to come along with the stubbornness in them to dig it free. When Delia cleared away the last of the choking muck, and the water came up cold and clean and began to run down the old race, for the first time in living memory, singing over the stones, she cupped it in her 2 black hands and drank, and it was the sweetest water she had ever tasted in the whole of her life. She did not yet know how precious it would prove. Before the year turned, she knew only that she had water now, good running water on 30 acres, that men had bought for 90 cents, because they swore to one another that nothing living could ever draw breath there. She sat by the running race a long while that evening, as the light went gold and then gray, and the town's old name for the place ran through her mind, Marsh's Misery, and she thought again that a name, like a piece of land, is only ever asleep or awake. The dry began not long after, exactly and precisely as the old man had said it would. It began so gently that no one in the valley marked it at first. Only a spring that stayed fair a week too long, and then a second week, and then a whole month. The clouds building up gray and heavy and full of promise in the west of an afternoon, and then sliding away off to the north without ever once dropping their rain. The creeks ran low, and then they ran lower. Wren Tucker's cattle, 400 acres of them, cropped the good bottomland brown to the roots, and then began to walk the fences bawling for the creek that had shrunk to a thread of warm mud. The corn in the good fields, the fields of the men who had leaned on her rail and laughed, came up thin and pale and curled its leaves tight against the sun, and tasseled early and stunted, and the wheat headed out no higher than a man's knee, and gave nothing worth the cutting. By the height of that summer, there had been no true rain in 9 weeks, and the word for the thing had quietly changed in every mouth, from a dry spell, which is a trouble that passes, to a drought, which is a thing that ruins men and empties valleys. Hunger changes a town. It changes it slowly, and then, all at once. The men who had leaned on Delia's fence to laugh now leaned on their own fences, and did not laugh at all, watching the pitiless sky, working their own bitter arithmetic and hating every figure of it. And, on 30 acres that had been the very poorest land in the whole valley, the spring ran on, cold and clean and steady. Delia had spent the last of the wet weeks she was given cleaning out the old mill race and mending the low earthen dam the long-dead mill builders had left behind, so that when the drought finally closed its dry hand around the county's throat, she had a full pond of cold spring water and a running channel, and 30 acres of ground broken so deep by 3 years of rooting hogs that it held what little dew fell in the night the way a sponge holds water. Her pumpkins swelled fat on the vine. Her turnips, fattened underground, where the killing heat could not reach them. Her corn, planted on the richest ground of all, the ground the oldest and worst briar had stood guard over, grew green and tall and straight, and shamed every browning field around it for miles. She had, in that terrible ruinous summer, food, she had water, she had more of both than one woman alone could ever hope to use. And she understood, standing hip-deep in her own green corn while the whole valley browned and cracked around her, that she had come at last to the place her grandmother and old Ansel had, each in their way, tried to prepare her for without ever quite putting it into words, the place where a person finds out what they are truly made of, which is not shown by how well they bear their own hardship, but by how they bear their good fortune, while everyone around them suffers want. The first to come was pride, made small and humble by need. It was a neighbor named Harl Denby, a proud, hard, close-fisted man who had never in 3 years given Delia a single civil word, and he came up her road on foot through the dust of an August evening with his hat literally crushed in his 2 hands, and he could not bring himself to look at her face. His children he began, and then could not finish the sentence at all. His well had gone dry to the mud. He managed, and the creek was nothing, and he had heard, everyone in the valley had heard by now, that the marsh place still had water running. He had come to ask if he might, and here his voice failed him altogether, and he had to start again, if he might buy a little of it. He said the word buy, the way a man says a word that costs him blood to speak. And here was the very moment the whole long story had been walking steadily toward. Though Delia had never once thought to expect it or to plan for it, she could have named him any price under heaven. A thirsty man with dying children will pay anything at all, will sign away his farm, and his name, and his future, will remember to his last day the person who bled him white in the hour of his weakness. Wren Tucker, standing where she stood, would have owned half the valley outright by first frost, and called it good business. She looked at Harl Denby, standing there in her road, unable to lift his eyes. And she thought of the courthouse steps and of Marsh's misery, and of 3 long years of laughter at her back. And she found, somewhat to her own quiet surprise, that there was no wish left anywhere in her to make this broken man pay for any part of it. "Bring your barrels," she said. "There's no charge for water. God put the spring there in the ground. I only dug it out again." Word of that ran faster through the parched valley than any drought ever could. By the next morning there were 3 wagons drawn up at her gate, and by the end of that week there were more than she could count. And Delia Marsh, who had come to the valley, scorned and friendless and alone, found her yard full, from dawn to dusk, of the very people who had scorned her. Come with their barrels and their buckets, to draw the water they could not live another week without. She let them fill from the running race, and she asked not 1 cent for any of it. And to those families whose children had gone hollow-cheeked and gaunt, she gave, besides the water, a sack of early turnips, a wagon basket heaped with squash, an armload of green corn still in the husk, telling them plainly and without ceremony that it was hers to give, and that she would not stand by and watch a child in the valley go hungry, while her own ground fairly groaned under more than she could ever eat alone. She was not a soft woman, and she did not do any of it softly. She did it the way she did every other thing in her life, plainly and quickly, and without a single wasted word, and perhaps that very plainness was the reason they believed it and could take it. A gift given with a fine long speech is only half a gift and half a sale, but a gift handed over like a plain fact of the world is a thing even a proud man can accept without breaking in two. Basket after basket after basket went out through her gate that ruined summer, and something else went out along with them that she had never planned and could never have bought with money. The slow, deep, grudging turning of a whole town's heart. But not every heart in the valley turned soft. Wren Tucker's heart turned another way entirely, and a colder one. He watched Delia's green fields and her running water, and then he looked at his own brown, cracked bottomland and his bawling, starving, bone-thin cattle, and where another man might have seen a neighbor's plain mercy at work, Wren Tucker saw only a valuable resource being poured out and wasted upon people too poor to be worth the pouring. He came to her gate at last in a polished buggy, in a clean black coat, wrapped in the smooth false warmth of a man who has privately decided that you are simple enough to be handled like a child. He praised her cleverness at great length. He allowed, generously, that he had perhaps misjudged her early on, and he said it in the manner of a man bestowing a costly gift. And then he laid out his proposition, which was this: that a young woman all alone could not possibly hope to manage a resource so valuable in a time so hard and so dangerous, that she would be cheated and overrun and worked into an early grave by grasping neighbors, and that the sensible thing, the safe and prudent thing, would be for her to sell the water rights and the low third of the place, the mill, the spring, the pond, all of it, to him at a fair and generous price, so that it might be managed properly by a man who understood such things. He would run a pipe down to his cattle. He would sell the water on to the town at a reasonable rate. He named a figure that was to a woman who had bought the whole 30 acres for $27, a genuine and staggering fortune, and he sat back and watched her face closely for the flood of grateful relief he was entirely certain would come rushing into it. She let him finish every word. She had learned 3 springs before the strange power of a silence a man had not himself caused, and she used that power on him now, letting the quiet stretch and stretch, and she watched him grow uneasy and then restless inside it. Then she asked him one plain, quiet question. She asked him how he had come to know the depth of her pond, for he had spoken of it just now exactly and precisely, its acre-foot of water, its worth, its likely yield through a long dry season, when he had never once in his life set a boot past her front gate to lay eyes upon it. And Wren Tucker, who was a shrewd and canny man, across a bargaining table, but had never in all his days been checked and cornered by a woman he had privately judged to be simple, made the one mistake that greedy men so often make in the presence of the very people they have most underestimated. He answered before he thought. He said, easily, that he'd had a man come out and survey it for him. And there it lay, set down on the ground between them, plain and undeniable as the millstone itself. He had sent a surveyor secretly onto her land, in the dark of it, to measure and to price the very water she was even then giving away for nothing. He had been planning, all along, from the very first, not to save the valley from its thirst, but to gate it. To buy the spring cheaply from the foolish trusting girl, and then to sell it dear back to the desperate dying town. She did not raise her voice so much as a note. She said only that the water was not for sale, not to him, not for that figure, nor for any figure he might name, because a thing given freely could not be bought up and gated behind a price without becoming a wholly different and poisoned thing, and that she would not be the one who made her neighbors pay to drink. Then she asked him quietly to leave her land, and to be so good as to send her the bill for his surveyor, since the man had plainly done all his careful measuring for her benefit in the end, and not for his. He might have gone away quietly then, and nursed his defeat in private, and waited for a better season and a longer memory. But he was too angry for that, and far too long accustomed to winning, and so he made his last and worst mistake in the one place in all the county where he should never have made it. He rode straight into town, and he stood upon the very same stretch of boardwalk where he had once mocked her openly, and he tried to turn the valley against her the way he had so easily turned it 3 springs before. He said she was a hoarder. He said her free water was a low trick meant to ruin honest men who sold theirs fair. He said a woman, the likes of that, could not be trusted with something the whole county's life depended on, and that the resource ought by rights to be taken in hand by sober, responsible men who knew its true value. But hunger had changed the town, and gratitude had changed it further still, and the men standing there listening to him had barrels in their own yards standing full of water they had not paid a single cent for, and children at their tables who had eaten her turnips and her corn, and they knew, now, every last one of them, exactly which of the 2 figures standing before them had gated the valley up tight in his own heart, and which had thrown the gate open wide and asked for nothing. And Harl Denby, of all the men in Callow County, the proudest of them, the one who had come up her road, with his hat crushed in his hands, was the one who spoke first. He said, loudly and in front of them all, that Wren Tucker had come and offered him water that summer too, for a price, for a lien upon his farm, for his signature on a paper, and that Delia Marsh had given him that same water for a kind word and a wagon. She had told him he need not even trouble to return empty. It is far easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit out loud that you were wrong to have mocked it. But it is not easy at all to go on believing it while you are standing there drinking its water and your children are alive because of it. The boardwalk went silent around Wren Tucker, the very way Delia's yard had once gone silent around her, and he stood in that silence and learned at last exactly how it had felt, and then he climbed back into his fine buggy, and he did not try that particular speech in that particular town again. The rains came at last in September, gray marching sheets of them, sweeping up the length of the valley, and the drought broke, and the creeks filled and ran clear, and the county did not starve that winter. But nothing in the valley went back to being the way it had been before, because a thing that has once been shown to people cannot afterward be unshown to them. The men who had called it Marsh's Misery did not call it by that name any more. They called it the Mill Place, for the old cider mill that Delia rebuilt board by board and stone by stone over that autumn and the long winter that followed it, set the great granite millstone back upon a new-cut oak bed, cut a fresh race down from the spring, and by the next fall was pressing sweet cider once again for the whole valley from the wild seedling orchards that had reseeded themselves in tangled rows across her cleared ground, the forgotten children of the very trees the first millers had planted and tended before anyone now living in Callow County had drawn a first breath. She charged a fair toll for the pressing, and never a penny more, and she let the poorest families bring their apples to the stone for free, and the mill ran and turned, and the pigs rooted the last far corners of the place open to the light, and the fields spread green and wide and generous over the ground, that the whole county had sold off for 90 cents an acre, because they had sworn to one another that nothing living could ever draw use from it. Old Ansel Vogt lived to see the mill turn again, which was a mercy, and he stood beside her on the day the stone first bit down into a bin of red apples, and the sweet must came running down warm into the trough, and he did not say a great deal, because he never had in all the years she knew him. He only laid his old spotted hand flat against the slow-turning stone, as if to feel with his own skin that the thing was real and not a dream of his long life, and then he said to her the very thing he had said at the beginning, on the fence rail in the raw gray cold of that first March morning. Land is only asleep, or land is awake, he said, and the whole of the difference between them is one person willing to wait. Then he turned and looked at her, at the woman who had come to the valley alone, and scorned, and had waited out 3 hard, bitter years, while an entire town stood laughing at her back, who had let humble pigs do the work that iron plows could not, and who had given away in a single season what a greedy man would have hoarded and gated for a lifetime. And he added to it the rest of the saying, the part he had held back, and kept these 3 years, until she had at last earned the hearing of it. And people, he said gently, are exactly the same. She kept the mill her whole long life after that, and she never married and never seemed to feel the want of it. And she bore no children of her own, but taught a full dozen of the valley's children, their letters and their sums, and how to read the lie of the ground and the temper of the sky. And when she herself was very old, the children of those children still brought their apples to the mill place every fall, to be pressed. And on the sill of her window, until the very day she died, she kept a single fist-sized greenbrier root, dried and gone hard as a stone, so that she would never once forget what the whole wide world had been so certain was worthless, and what it had turned out to be worth in the end, in patient and stubborn hands.